My son looked me straight in the eye at Christmas dinner and said, "Dad, maybe it's time you found somewhere else to celebrate the holidays." 32 years I'd been coming to this restaurant with my family. 32 years of birthdays, anniversaries, and every major milestone. But that night, as I watched my own children nod in agreement, treating me like I was some unwanted stranger, I made a decision that would change everything. By the time dessert was served, I owned the place. The phone rang on a Tuesday morning in early December, and when I saw Michael's name on the screen, I felt that familiar flutter of hope in my chest. At 68, I've learned not to expect too much from my children's calls, but I can't help myself. Each ring still carries the possibility that today might be different, that today they might actually need their father for something more than a quick check-in or a polite update about their lives. "Hey, Dad." Michael's voice came through clear but distant, the way it always sounds these days. Professional, measured, like he's talking to a client rather than the man who taught him to tie his shoes and throw a baseball. "Michael, good to hear from you, son." I settled into my kitchen chair, the same one I've sat in every morning for the past 40 years, the same one Margaret used to tease me about because it creaks when I lean back. "How are Linda and the kids?" "They're good, Dad. Listen, I wanted to call about Christmas dinner. We're thinking of doing it at Romano's again this year. You know, keep the tradition going." Romano's, our family restaurant for over 3 decades, the place where we celebrated every birthday, every graduation, every milestone that mattered. The place where Margaret and I had our anniversary dinners, where the kids brought their dates to meet us, where we gathered after her funeral 2 years ago because one of us could bear the thought of cooking. "That sounds wonderful," I said, and I meant it, more than he could possibly know. "Same time as always?" "Yeah, 6:30 on Christmas Eve. Sarah and David will be there with their families too. It'll be nice to have everyone together." Something in his voice caught my attention, a hesitation, a weight behind the words that I couldn't quite identify. But I pushed the feeling away because I wanted this invitation too much to question it. I wanted to believe that my children still saw me as part of the family, still valued my presence at their table. "I'll be there," I said. "Wouldn't miss it." After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, holding the phone and feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Purpose, anticipation, something to look forward to beyond the endless stretch of empty days that had become my life since Margaret died. If you've ever felt the weight of loneliness after losing the love of your life, if you've ever wondered whether your own children still need you, I hope you'll stay with me through this story. Please like this video if it resonates with you, and subscribe if you want to hear more. Your comments mean more to me than you know. I should have recognized the signs earlier. Looking back now, they were all there, scattered across the weeks and months like breadcrumbs, leading to an inevitable destination I was too lonely to see. The phone calls had been getting shorter, where we used to talk for 20 or 30 minutes, catching up on their lives, their work, their children's activities. Now our conversations lasted barely 5 minutes. Polite inquiries about my health, brief updates about their schedules, and then excuses about having to run, having to get back to something more important than talking to their father. Michael used to call every Sunday morning, a tradition that started when he moved out for college and continued through his marriage and the birth of his 2 children. We'd talk about sports, about work, about whatever was happening in our lives. He'd ask for advice about his job, about parenting, about fixing things around the house. I lived for those calls. They made me feel useful, needed, still relevant in his life. But the calls started coming on different days, then every other week. Then only when he had something specific to tell me, some family news that couldn't be delivered through Sarah or David. The conversations became efficient, transactional. Information exchanged rather than relationships maintained. Sarah had been even more direct in her gradual withdrawal. She'd always been the most emotional of my children, the one most likely to call when she was upset or excited or needed someone to listen. After her divorce 3 years ago, I was the one she turned to, the one who helped her through those dark months when she couldn't see past her anger and hurt. I drove to her house at all hours, helped her move, watched her kids when she needed space to fall apart and put herself back together. But after Margaret's funeral, something shifted. Her calls became less frequent, less personal. When I'd ask about her dating life or how she was handling single parenthood, she'd give me short, vague answers and change the subject. When I'd offer to help with the kids or to come visit, she'd tell me she was fine, that she had everything under control, that she didn't want to burden me with her problems. Burden me. As if loving my daughter and grandchildren was some kind of hardship rather than the thing that gave my life meaning. David, my youngest, had always been the most distant, but even his minimal contact had dwindled to almost nothing. He'd struggled with addiction. Ion in his 20s, and I'd been there for every failed attempt at sobriety, every relapse, every promise that this time would be different. I'd given him money when I probably shouldn't have, made excuses for him when I should have let him face the consequences, loved him through every disappointment because that's what fathers do. When he finally got clean 2 years ago, I thought we'd grown closer through the experience. I thought he'd learned to value our relationship, to appreciate the support I'd given him even when everyone else had given up. But success seemed to make him forget rather than remember. The grateful phone calls stopped. The visits became rare. When I'd reach out to check on him, he'd respond with text messages instead of calls, brief updates that told me nothing about his emotional state or his daily life. I told myself it was natural. Children grow up, move away, build their own lives. They don't need their father the way they used to. They have spouses, children, careers, friends, responsibilities that matter more than maintaining relationships with aging parents. This is the natural order of things, I reasoned. This is how families evolve. But late at night, in the quiet house where Margaret and I had raised our family, where her absence echoed in every room and every memory, the rational explanations felt hollow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being managed rather than loved, tolerated rather than welcomed, slowly but deliberately erased from their lives. The evidence was everywhere once I started paying attention. Family photos on social media that didn't include me, grandchildren's birthday parties that happened without me knowing until afterward, when someone would mention them casually in passing. Holiday plans discussed around me rather than with me, as if my presence was assumed rather than desired. I started noticing how conversations would pause when I entered a room, how my children would exchange glances that seemed to communicate something I wasn't supposed to understand. I started feeling like I was interrupting rather than participating, intruding rather than belonging. The loneliness had made me hypersensitive to every slight, real or imagined. Without Margaret to serve as my translator, my bridge to our children's lives, I was left to navigate these relationships on my own, and I was failing miserably. She had always been the one who knew what they needed, who understood their moods and motivations, who could smooth over the rough edges of family dynamics with a phone call or a careful word. Margaret would have known what to do about the growing distance. She would have confronted them directly or found some gentle way to remind them that I was still their father, still deserving of their time and attention and love. She would have made sure I remained part of the family instead of becoming a peripheral figure in my own children's lives. But Margaret was gone, and I was left to figure out how to be a father and grandfather without her guidance, without her interpretation of the subtle communications that seemed to flow so naturally between her and our children. So when Michael's invitation came, I grabbed onto it like a lifeline. Finally, I thought. Finally, they want to spend time with me. Finally, I'll have a chance to show them that I'm still the same man who raised them, still someone worth including in their lives. I spent the 3 weeks between that phone call and Christmas Eve preparing for the dinner with an enthusiasm that probably should have embarrassed me. I went through my closet multiple times, selecting and rejecting shirts and ties until I settled on the navy blue button-down that Margaret had always said brought out my eyes. I bought a bottle of wine from the shop where the owner knew me by name. Choosing a vintage I remembered Michael mentioning he'd enjoyed at some work function. I practiced conversations in my head, rehearsing stories about my volunteer work at the library, updates about the neighbors they'd grown up knowing, memories from their childhoods that I thought might make them smile. I wanted to be interesting, engaging, the kind of father they'd be proud to have at their table. I even got a haircut 3 days before Christmas Eve, asking the barber to take a little extra off the sides so I'd look younger, more vital. I wanted my children to see that I was still taking care of myself, still someone worth their time and attention. The night before the dinner, I laid out my clothes like I was preparing for a job interview. I polished my shoes, trimmed my fingernails, made sure my wallet had enough cash to cover my share of the bill, even though Michael had always insisted on paying for these family gatherings. I wanted to be prepared for anything, to show them that I was still capable, still independent, still deserving of their respect. I went to bed that night feeling more hopeful than I had in months. Tomorrow, I told myself, things would be different. Tomorrow, I'd have my family back. Tomorrow I'd prove that their father still had value, still had something to offer, still belonged at their table and in their lives. I had no idea that I was preparing for my own execution, carefully choosing the clothes I'd wear to my own funeral as a father. I had no idea that the people I loved most in the world had already decided I was no longer welcome in their lives, that the invitation was just their way of making the dismissal official. I went to sleep that night, believing that family dinner would bring us closer together, never imagining that it would be the night they told me I no longer had. A place in the family I'd spent my entire adult life building, Romano's looked exactly the same as it had for 32 years. The same red checkered tablecloths, the same warm lighting from those amber glass fixtures, the same smell of garlic and tomato sauce that had welcomed our family through decades of celebrations. When I pushed through the heavy wooden door at exactly 6:25, 5 minutes early as I always was, I expected to feel the comfort of coming home. Instead, I felt like I was walking into a courtroom. My children were already there, seated around our usual large corner table, all three of them, with their spouses, arranged in what looked like a carefully orchestrated formation. Michael sat at what had always been my spot at the head of the table, with Linda beside him. Sarah and her new boyfriend, a man I'd met only twice, occupied the seats that used to be reserved for Margaret and me. David and his wife Jennifer were positioned across from them, leaving a single empty chair at the far end of the table. Not at the head, where I'd sat for 3 decades as the father, the patriarch, the one who carved the meat and told the stories and made the toasts. This chair was at the foot, isolated, facing the group like a defendant facing a jury. "Dad, you made it," Michael said, standing to shake my hand instead of hugging me the way he used to, the way Margaret always insisted our family greet each other, right on time, as always. There was something in his voice that I couldn't identify. Not warmth exactly, but not coldness either. A kind of professional politeness that you'd use with a business acquaintance or a distant relative you only see at funerals. I shook hands with all of them, receiving polite kisses on the cheek from Sarah and Jennifer, brief hugs that felt more like obligations than expressions of affection. David barely looked up from his phone as he mumbled a greeting. "Sorry I'm a few minutes early," I said, settling into the chair that had been designated for me. Traffic was lighter than I expected. "No problem at all," Sarah said, her voice bright in that artificial way that meant she was working hard to sound normal. "We were just catching up on everyone's holiday plans." Holiday plans. Conversations that had apparently been happening without me. I noticed immediately that they'd already ordered appetizers. Calamari and bruschetta sat in the center of the table, half-eaten, evidence that they'd been here long enough to get comfortable without me. In all our years of family dinners, we'd never ordered before everyone arrived. It was an unspoken rule, one of those family courtesies that showed respect for each person's time and presence. "I brought wine," I said, reaching for the bottle I'd carefully selected, that Chianti Michael mentioned liking. "Thanks, Dad," Michael said, but he didn't open it. Instead, he gestured to the glasses already on the table. "We went ahead and ordered a bottle already. Maybe we'll save this one for later." Later, when I wouldn't be there to share it. The conversation resumed around me, and I realized with growing unease that it was the same conversation they'd been having before I arrived. Sarah was talking about her plans to take the kids skiing in Colorado. David was describing the new house he and Jennifer had just bought. Michael was explaining why they'd decided to spend New Year's in Florida with Linda's parents. All of them had elaborate holiday plans, none of which included me. "Colorado sounds wonderful," I said, trying to insert myself into Sarah's story about the ski resort. "Remember when we took you kids to Vermont that one winter? You were about 12, I think. You spent the whole first day on the bunny slope, too scared to try the real hills." Sarah's smile was polite, but distant. "I remember. That was a long time ago." "Not that long," I said, laughing, hoping to recapture some warmth in her voice. "You ended up loving it by the end of the week. Couldn't get you off the mountain. Your mother had to practically drag you back to the lodge." "Kids are different now," Sarah said, turning back to Jennifer. "These resorts have much better programs for children, more structured, more professional." The dismissal was gentle but unmistakable. My memory, my story, my connection to her childhood, brushed aside like an interruption in a more important conversation. I tried again with David's house story, asking about the neighborhood, the schools, the commute to his office. But his answers were brief, almost monosyllabic, delivered without making eye contact. When I offered advice about homeownership, lessons I'd learned from 40 years of maintaining the house where I'd raised them, he nodded absently and changed the subject. It was like trying to hold conversation with people who were humoring me rather than engaging with me, Every contribution I made fell flat. Every story I shared was met with polite but empty acknowledgement. Every question I asked received the minimum possible response. I kept looking around the table, waiting for someone to ask about my life, my volunteer work, my health, my plans. The kinds of questions families ask each other, the give and take of people who care about each other's daily experiences. But the questions never came. The conversation flowed around me as if I were invisible, a piece of furniture they had to accommodate but didn't need to include. Margaret's absence felt like a physical presence at that table. She would have been sitting beside me, translating the undercurrents I couldn't read, drawing me into conversations, making sure I felt valued and heard. She would have remembered my stories, built on them, helped me connect with our children instead of watching helplessly as they drifted further away. Without her, I was just an old man trying desperately to remain relevant in the lives of people who had already moved on without him. The waiter came to take our dinner orders, and I realized with a start that I hadn't even looked at the menu. I'd been so focused on trying to reconnect with my children that I'd forgotten this was supposed to be a meal, a shared experience, a celebration of family. "I'll have the usual," I said, the same order I'd been placing at Romano's for 30 years. Chicken parmesan with a side of pasta, the dish Margaret always teased me about because I never tried anything different. "Actually, Dad," Michael said, glancing at the others before continuing, "they've changed the menu quite a bit. That might not be available anymore." I looked down at the menu in my hands, scanning for familiar items, and realized he was right. Everything was different, fancier, more expensive, more sophisticated than the comfort food that had made Romano's our family place for 3 decades. "Oh," I said, feeling foolish and old-fashioned. "I guess I'll need a minute to decide." "The salmon is supposed to be excellent," Linda offered, her voice kind but distant, the way you'd help a stranger navigate an unfamiliar situation. I ordered the salmon, though I would have preferred something simpler, something that felt more like the Romanos I remembered. Everything was changing, including this place that had been our constant for so many years. As dinner progressed, I found myself studying my children's faces, looking for signs of the people I'd raised, the kids who used to compete for my attention and approval. Michael, my firstborn, who used to call me his hero and follow me around the house, asking endless questions about how things worked. Sarah, my daughter, who used to crawl into my lap to read bedtime stories and tell me about her dreams and fears. David, my baby, who used to beg me to stay just 5 more minutes at bedtime, who used to cry when I had to leave for business trips. They were still there, somewhere beneath the polite adults who sat across from me making conversation about mortgages and school districts and vacation plans. But I couldn't reach them. I couldn't find the key that would unlock the easy intimacy we used to share, the natural affection that had once made me the most important man in their lives. Their laughter felt rehearsed when it came. Their questions to each other were detailed and interested, full of the kind of genuine curiosity that showed they cared about the answers. But when they looked at me, their expressions were guarded, patient, the way you'd look at someone you were obligated to spend time with rather than someone you chose to love. I found myself checking my watch, calculating how much longer this dinner would last, wondering when it had become something to endure rather than something to enjoy. These were my children, the people I loved most in the world, and I was sitting at their table feeling like an unwelcome guest. The realization hit me slowly, like a tide that creeps up the beach so gradually you don't notice until the water is at your feet. This wasn't a family reunion. This wasn't a celebration. This wasn't even a normal dinner. This was something else entirely, something that required their careful coordination, their nervous energy, their obvious discomfort with my presence. They had invited me here for a reason, and it wasn't because they missed their father. The knowledge settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold and undeniable. Whatever was coming next, whatever they had planned to say or do, it wasn't going to be the connection I'd been hoping for. I was sitting at a table with my 3 children, surrounded by the echoes of 32 years of family memories, and I had never felt more alone in my life. Chapter 3. The Words That Shattered Everything. The moment came just as we were finishing our main courses. I should have seen it in the way Michael straightened in his chair, the way Sarah set down her fork with deliberate precision, the way David finally looked up from his phone and focused on something other than his own reflection in the screen. The air around our table shifted, became charged with the kind of tension that comes before someone says something they can't take back. Michael cleared his throat. Not the casual clearing you do when you're about to ask for the salt or comment on the food. This was the kind of throat clearing that announces something important, something prepared, something that requires the full attention of everyone at the table. "Dad," he began, and his voice had the tone I recognized from his job as a marketing executive. Measured, professional, detached from any personal emotion that might complicate the message he was about to deliver. "We wanted to talk to you about something tonight, all of us together." The words hit me like a physical blow, though I couldn't yet understand why. Something about the way he said "all of us together" made it clear that they had discussed this beforehand, that whatever was coming had been planned and rehearsed and agreed upon without me. "Of course," I said, setting down my own fork, trying to prepare myself for whatever this was. "What's on your mind?" Sarah leaned forward slightly, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Dad, we've been talking about you a lot lately, about how you're doing since Mom died, about your living situation, about—" She paused, searching for words that had probably been carefully chosen in advance. "About your social connections. Social connections, as if I were a networking problem to be solved, rather than their father trying to maintain relationships with his children. We're worried about you," David added, speaking directly to me for the first time all evening. "You seem lonely, isolated. We think you're maybe depending on us too much for your social needs. Depending on them too much. For wanting to have dinner with my own children a few times a year. For calling to check on their lives and their children. For hoping they still saw value in maintaining a relationship with their father." "I don't understand," I said, though part of me was beginning to understand all too well. "I'm doing fine. I volunteer at the library twice a week. I have friends. I keep busy." "We know you do," Michael said, his tone suggesting he was working from a script they'd all agreed upon. "But we think it might be healthy for you to expand your social circle, to find people who are in similar life circumstances, people your own age who share your interests." People my own age. As if my children had aged out of my demographic. As if the 25 and 30-year age differences between us had suddenly become insurmountable barriers to maintaining family relationships. "We think," Sarah continued, "it might be better if you spent the holidays with people who can better relate to where you are in your life right now. Maybe find some activities at the senior center. Join some clubs. Make some friends who aren't busy with young children and demanding careers." The words were coming at me like punches, each one landing with devastating precision. They had clearly thought this through, probably discussed it multiple times, maybe even consulted with their spouses about the best way to deliver this message. They weren't speaking spontaneously from the heart. They were executing a plan. "I don't want to make friends at the senior center," I said, hearing the desperation creeping into my voice and hating myself for it. "I want to spend time with my family, with my children and grandchildren." "And we want that too, Dad," Michael said, though nothing in his tone suggested he actually wanted anything of the kind. "But we think you'd be happier if you had a more varied social life, if you weren't putting all your emotional needs on us. Emotional needs. As if loving them and wanting to be part of their lives was some kind of burden I was imposing rather than the most natural thing in the world." "Your grandchildren find it a little overwhelming sometimes," Sarah said, not meeting my eyes. "When you ask so many questions about their school and their activities, they're not used to that level of attention. Attention. I was guilty of paying too much attention to my own grandchildren, of caring too much about their lives and their interests and their daily experiences." "And honestly, Dad," David said, finally finding his voice now that his siblings had broken the ice, "some of your stories, they're from a different time. The kids don't really relate to them. It makes family gatherings a little awkward." My stories, the memories I'd carefully curated from their childhoods, the experiences I'd thought we shared, the history of our family that I'd believed was precious to all of us. Awkward, outdated, irrelevant. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. My children, the people I had raised, supported, loved unconditionally through every phase of their lives, were systematically dismantling my place in their family. They were doing it kindly, with what they probably thought was compassion, but they were doing it thoroughly and definitively. "We just think," Michael continued, "that it would be healthier for everyone if you found your primary social support somewhere else. We'll still see you, of course, but maybe not for every holiday, maybe not as often, maybe in smaller groups rather than big family gatherings. Smaller groups. Translation, maybe not at all, but will let you down easy with vague promises of future contact that will never materialize. We love you, Dad, Sarah said, and for the first time that evening, her voice cracked slightly with genuine emotion. But we have our own lives to live, our own families to focus on. We can't be your whole world. I wasn't asking them to be my whole world. I was asking them to let me remain part of their world, the way I had been for the past 30-plus years of their lives. I was asking for the same consideration they'd show any other family member, the same basic inclusion that defined what it meant to belong to something larger than yourself. But as I looked around the table at their faces, guilty but determined, sad but resolute, I realized that I was no longer family to them. I was a responsibility they wanted to discharge, an obligation they were seeking to minimize, a problem they were trying to solve as efficiently as possible. The irony was breathtaking. I had worked 2 jobs for 15 years to pay for their educations. I had missed weekends and evenings and vacations to make sure they had everything they needed to build successful lives. I had supported them through failures and celebrated their successes, been there for every crisis and every milestone, sacrificed my own comfort and convenience whenever they needed something from me. And now they were telling me that my love, my attention, my desire to remain connected to them was too much to bear. I raised you, I said quietly, the words coming out before I could stop them. I was there for every soccer game, every school play, every middle-of-the-night emergency. I helped you through college, through your first jobs, through divorces and addiction and every crisis you've faced as adults. We know that, Dad, Michael said, and we're grateful, but that was your job as a parent. You don't get to use that as leverage to make demands on our adult lives. Leverage. Demands. As if wanting to have dinner with it. Mind them occasionally with some kind of manipulation, rather than the most basic expression of family love. We're not trying to hurt you, David said, though he was doing exactly that with every word. We're trying to help you understand that you need to build a life that doesn't revolve around us. My life didn't revolve around them. My life revolved around the empty house where their mother died, around the volunteer work that filled my days but not my heart, around the slow recognition that everything I had built and worked for was disappearing piece by piece. They were the only connection I had left to the life I'd lived for 40 years as a husband and father. And they were taking that away from me too. So that's it? I asked. You're uninviting me from Christmas? From family gatherings? From being your father? You'll always be our father, Sarah said, tears forming in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. But we think some space would be good for everyone, some boundaries, some opportunity for you to find fulfillment that doesn't depend on us. Boundaries, the word that modern families use to justify cutting people out of their lives while pretending it's for everyone's benefit. I looked around the table one more time, studying the faces of the 3 people I had loved more than my own life, the people I had thought would love me back unconditionally until the day I died. They weren't cruel people. They weren't heartless. They were just tired of having a father who needed them, who wanted to be part of their lives, who hadn't gotten the memo that modern families don't work the way families used to work. They had made their decision, and no amount of pleading or reasoning or reminding them of our shared history was going to change it. I was being dismissed from the family I had spent my entire adult life building, and they were doing it with the same calm efficiency they'd used to fire an underperforming employee. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself. The worst part was how comfortable they seemed with it, how easily they had convinced themselves that this was the right thing to do, how readily they had agreed that their father's love had become more burden than blessing. I sat there in the restaurant where we had celebrated 32 years of family milestones, surrounded by my children, and felt the last connection to my old life snapping like a rope that had finally carried more weight than it could bear. The strangest part wasn't what they said to me. The strangest part was what happened after they said it. Nothing. They just went back to eating. I sat there in complete shock, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, and my children calmly picked up their forks and continued with their salmon and pasta and chicken as if they hadn't just removed me from their lives. As if the conversation we'd just had was no more significant than discussing the weather or commenting on the restaurant's new menu. Michael took a sip of wine and asked Jennifer about her sister's wedding plans. Sarah laughed at something David said about his new boss. Linda complimented the restaurant's bread, which had always been homemade but apparently now came from some artisanal bakery across town. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone, natural and unimpeded and completely unconcerned with the devastation they had just delivered. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and demand they acknowledge what they had just done, force them to look at me and see the pain they had caused, make them understand that you can't just dismiss a father like an unwanted subscription service and then go back to casual dinner conversation. But I couldn't find my voice. I couldn't find the words that would adequately express the magnitude of what I was feeling. So I sat there, fork in hand, staring about. Take my half-eaten dinner and listening to them discuss their holiday plans, the plans that no longer included me. "We're thinking of renting a cabin in Tahoe for New Year's," Michael said to Sarah. "The kids would love the snow, and it's been years since we've done a real family vacation." A real family vacation. Without me. Because apparently, I was no longer part of the real family. "That sounds amazing," Sarah replied. "We might join you if I can get the time off work. The kids have been asking about skiing lessons." They were making plans for a future that excluded me, right in front of me, as if I were already gone, as if the conversation we'd just had magically transported me out of their lives and into some parallel universe where I no longer existed as their father. I found myself studying their faces, looking for some sign of remorse or uncertainty, or second thoughts about what they had just done. But there was nothing. If anything, they seemed relieved. The tension that had been hanging over the table earlier was gone, replaced by the easy camaraderie of people who had successfully completed an unpleasant but necessary task. They had been dreading this conversation, I realized. Not because they felt guilty about what they were going to say, but because they hadn't been sure how I would take it. Now that it was over, now that I had received their message quietly and without making a scene, they could relax and enjoy the rest of their evening. The waiter came by to refill our water glasses, and I watched him move around the table with the kind of professional efficiency that comes from years of serving families at Romano's. He had probably seen 3 generations of families celebrate here, had probably served grandparents and parents and children, had probably witnessed countless family gatherings over the decades. I wondered if he could sense what had just happened at our table. If he noticed that the older man at the end seemed to have stopped participating in the conversation, stopped eating, stopped being part of whatever celebration this was supposed to be. But he was too professional to show any curiosity, too experienced to get involved in family drama. He filled my glass and moved on, just like my children had delivered their verdict and moved on. The normalcy of their behavior felt like a second betrayal, somehow worse than the initial rejection. I could have handled anger, accusations, a dramatic confrontation that at least acknowledged the significance of what was happening. I could have responded to cruelty or emotional manipulation, or even honest resentment about something I had done wrong. But this casual dismissal, this comfortable return to dinner conversation after they had just excommunicated me from the family, this was something I had no defense against. This suggested that removing me from their lives required no more emotional energy than canceling a gym membership or switching phone providers. I started thinking about all the signs I had missed or misinterpreted over the past 2 years. Since Margaret's death, my children had been pulling away, but I had convinced myself it was temporary. I thought they were giving me space to grieve, time to adjust to life without their mother. I thought the distance was about my needs, not their desires. But now I understood that Margaret hadn't just been the love of my life and the center of our family. She had been the buffer between me and my children's growing impatience with having an aging father who still wanted to be part of their lives. When Margaret was alive, family gatherings were different. She was the one who called everyone to coordinate schedules, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who made sure I felt included in conversations and decisions. She was the one who translated between my generation and theirs, who smoothed over the rough edges of family dynamics with her natural warmth and diplomatic skills. Without her, I had been trying to maintain those connections on my own, and apparently I had been doing it all wrong. My calls were too frequent, my questions too intrusive, my stories too outdated, my need for connection too desperate. Margaret would have known how to navigate this new reality. She would have found the right balance between staying involved and giving them space, between being a loving parent and respecting their boundaries, between maintaining family relationships and accepting the natural evolution of adult children's lives. But Margaret was gone, and I had been flailing around for 2 years trying to figure out how to be a father and grandfather without her guidance, and my children, instead of helping me learn, instead of being patient with my mistakes, had simply decided it was easier to remove me from the equation entirely. I thought about Margaret's funeral, how my children had handled all the arrangements with impressive efficiency but minimal emotional involvement. They had been kind to me, certainly, supportive during those first terrible weeks. But even then, I had sensed a distance, a professional competence that felt more like managing a crisis than sharing grief. They had encouraged me to take care of myself and find new interests and consider what Mom would want for you. At the time, I thought they were being thoughtful, giving me permission to move forward without feeling guilty about finding happiness after loss. Now I realized they had been preparing me for a life without them. They had been gently but persistently pushing me toward independence, not because they thought it would be good for me, but because they were already planning to step back from their responsibilities as adult children. The waiter returned with dessert menus, and I watched my children study them with the same attention they had given their dinner choices. They were planning to stay for dessert, to extend this evening, to continue this family gathering from which I had just been symbolically excluded. "The tiramisu here is supposed to be incredible," Linda said, the kind of enthusiastic recommendation that keeps conversation flowing naturally. "I'm too full," Sarah replied, patting her stomach. "But maybe we could share something?" They were making dessert decisions together, planning to share something sweet, extending their time together, while I sat at the same table feeling like a stranger who had accidentally been seated with the wrong party. Michael signaled for the check, and I realized the evening was almost over. Soon we would all stand up, exchange polite goodbyes, and go our separate ways. They would go back to their lives, their homes, their families, their futures, and I would go back to my empty house with the knowledge that I was no longer welcome in the life I had spent 40 years building. But something was shifting inside me as I watched Michael reach for his wallet with the casual authority of someone who was used to taking charge of family situations. Something was moving from devastation toward determination, from heartbreak toward a kind of cold clarity I hadn't felt in years. They thought they could dismiss me politely and efficiently, like ending a business relationship that was no longer profitable for either party. They thought they could remove me from their lives without consequences, that I would accept their decision with the same quiet resignation I had shown to every other loss and disappointment of the past 2 years. They were wrong. "Excuse me," I said, pushing back my chair. "I need to use the restroom." It was the first thing I'd said in nearly 12 years. Empty minutes, and my voice sounded strange in my own ears. Rough, distant, like it was coming from someone else. My children barely looked up from their dessert discussions, offering distracted nods as I stood and walked away from the table. But I didn't head toward the restroom. Instead, I walked straight to the front of the restaurant, where the hostess station stood near the entrance. The same station where Margaret and I had checked in for countless anniversary dinners, where we'd waited for tables during busy nights, where Romano himself used to greet us by name and ask about the children. "Excuse me," I said to the young woman behind the podium. "I need to speak with Romano. Is he here tonight?" She looked up from her reservation book with the polite confusion of someone who doesn't recognize me as a regular customer, which I suppose I hadn't been, not recently, not since Margaret died and family dinners became rare, awkward events rather than monthly celebrations. "Mr. Romano is in the kitchen," she said. "Is there a problem with your meal?" "No problem," I said. "Just tell him that Frank Morrison would like to speak with him. He'll know who I am." She hesitated, probably wondering whether this was the kind of request that required management intervention, but something in my expression must have convinced her to take me seriously. She picked up the phone and spoke quietly into it, then nodded toward the kitchen. "He'll be right out," she said. I stood there waiting, aware that my children were probably wondering where I'd gone, probably assuming I was having some kind of emotional breakdown in the bathroom. The thought almost made me laugh. They had no idea what kind of breakdown I was actually having, what kind of decision was crystallizing in my mind as I stood in the restaurant where my family had shared so many memories. Romano emerged from the kitchen still wearing his apron, his weathered hands wiping flour from his fingers. He was older than I remembered, probably in his 70s now, but his eyes still held the warmth and intelligence that had made him such a good host for all these years. "Frank," he said, and his voice carried the slight Italian accent that had never completely disappeared despite 5 decades in America. "It's good to see you. How is the family? How are you doing?" How was I doing? The question I'd been asking myself for 2 years, the question my children had apparently decided they knew the answer to better than I did. "I'm not doing so well, Romano," I said, and the honesty felt like relief after months of pretending everything was fine. "But I might be about to do something that changes that. He studied my face with the perceptive eyes of someone who had spent decades reading customers' moods, understanding the difference between people who wanted conversation and people who needed help. "Come," he said, gesturing toward a small office behind the hostess station. "We talk." The office was tiny, cramped with filing cabinets and restaurant supplies, but it offered privacy from the dining room, and the conversation I knew was continuing without me at our table. Romano closed the door and settled into a chair behind a desk covered with invoices and order forms. "What can I do for you, my friend?" he asked. And suddenly, without planning it, without thinking it through, I heard myself asking a question that surprised both of us. "Romano, what would it take to buy this place?" He blinked, tilted his head, probably wondering if he had misunderstood my English, or if grief had finally driven me completely around the bend. "You want to buy Romano's?" he asked. "I want to know if it's possible," I said. "If you'd be interested in selling, what it would cost, whether you think I could handle it." The questions were coming out of my mouth before my brain had fully processed them, but they felt right in a way nothing had felt right in months. This restaurant, this place where my family had celebrated every important moment for 32 years, this space that held more memories of Margaret and the children than anywhere else in the world except our house, it could be mine. Romano leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of careful attention he probably gave to suppliers who made unexpected proposals or customers who complained about the food. "Frank," he said slowly, "you know this is not easy business. Long hours, difficult work, many headaches with staff and customers, and everything is not retirement job." "I'm not looking for a retirement job," I said. "I'm looking for a purpose." The truth of that statement hit me as I said it. For 2 years I'd been drifting through days filled with activities that meant nothing to me, volunteer work that felt like obligation rather than fulfillment, social interactions that never progressed beyond polite pleasantries. I'd been trying to build a new life that would somehow replace the old one, but everything I tried felt hollow and temporary. But this felt like something solid, something meaningful, something that would give me back the control over my own life that I'd been steadily losing since Margaret died. "The restaurant business," Romano continued, "is not for everyone. You have experience with this kind of work?" "I have experience with running things," I said. "I managed a construction company for 30 years. I know about budgets and schedules and dealing with people. I know about solving problems and making decisions and taking responsibility for outcomes." All of which was true, though I wasn't sure any of it translated to running a restaurant. But I was discovered. In that I didn't care about the practical challenges. I cared about the possibility, the potential, the chance to do something that would change everything about my current situation. Romano was quiet for a long moment, probably calculating numbers in his head, weighing the pros and cons of selling to someone who might have no idea what he was getting into. "My father, he built this place," he said finally. 43 years ago. I take over when he retire, 15 years now. Is not easy to think about selling." "I understand," I said. "But I also know you've been working 7 days a week for 15 years, and I know you're not getting any younger." He nodded slowly. We both knew he was tired, that running a restaurant was a young man's game, and he was no longer young. "What you think you pay?" he asked. The question that would determine whether this was a realistic possibility or just the desperate fantasy of a man who had lost everything else that mattered to him. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I have savings. I have my retirement fund. I have the life insurance for Margaret's death. I have equity in my house if I need to access it. Tell me what it would take, and I'll tell you if I can make it work." Romano pulled out a calculator and started writing numbers on a piece of paper. Cost of inventory, value of equipment, monthly rent on the building, average revenue over the past 3 years, the kinds of concrete details that could turn an impulsive decision into an actual transaction. As he worked, I could hear voices from the dining room, the sounds of families enjoying their evening meals, the comfortable noise of a successful restaurant doing what restaurants do. Somewhere in that dining room, my children were probably finishing their desserts and wondering when their father would return from his extended bathroom break. They had no idea that their father was sitting in a tiny office, negotiating to buy a place where they had just told him he was no longer welcome at family gatherings. "For you," Romano said, sliding the paper across the desk, "because I know you are a good man, because your family has been coming here for so many years, because I think you understand what this place means. 350,000. I looked at the number, calculated quickly in my head what I could access between my savings and Margaret's life insurance and my retirement account. It would be tight, but it was possible. More than possible. It was perfect. "Romano," I said, "I'll take it." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and handshakes that changed everything about my life in ways my children couldn't possibly imagine. Romano made calls to his lawyer, his accountant, his business banker. I made calls to my financial advisor, my insurance agent, the attorney who had handled Margaret's estate. Within 45 minutes, we had the framework of a deal that would transfer ownership of Romano's restaurant to me by the end of the week. My retirement savings, Margaret's life insurance, and a business loan secured by the restaurant's assets and track record would cover the purchase price. Romano would stay on for 6 months as a consultant to help me learn the business, train me on the systems, introduce me to suppliers and staff. His lawyer would draft the papers tomorrow morning. I was buying a restaurant. At 68 years old, 2 hours after my children had told me to find new friends at the senior center, I was becoming a business owner in an industry I knew nothing about, and it felt like the first thing I had done in 2 years that made any sense at all. "Frank," Romano said, gripping my hand as we finalized the basic terms, "you are sure about this? Is big decision, big change? Your family, they know what you're doing?" "My family," I said, thinking about the conversation that had driven me to this moment, "is about to find out." Romano's eyes crinkled with something that looked like understanding. He had probably seen enough family dynamics play out in his dining room over 4 decades to recognize the signs of a man taking back control of his life. "Is good," he said simply. "Sometimes we need to surprise even ourselves." When I walked back into the dining room, my children were exactly where I had left them. Still sitting around the table, still talking casually about their lives and plans, still comfortable in their decision to remove me from their future gatherings. The dessert plates were mostly empty, and Michael had already asked for the check. I slid back into my chair, and Sarah glanced up with mild concern. "Dad, are you okay? You were gone for quite a while." "I'm fine," I said, settling into my seat with a calmness I hadn't felt in months. "Just fine." The waiter arrived with the bill, setting it discreetly beside Michael's elbow. My son reached for it with the automatic authority of someone who always handled these family expenses, the same gesture he'd made at dozens of dinners over the years. But I placed my hand gently on his arm, stopping him before he could pick up the leather folder. "Don't worry about it," I said quietly. "It's on the house." The confusion on their faces was immediate and obvious. Linda looked from me to Michael with raised eyebrows. Sarah tilted her head with the expression she'd worn since childhood, when she couldn't understand something I'd said. David actually looked up from his phone. "What do you mean it's on the house?" Sarah asked. "I mean," I said, savoring this moment more than I probably should have, "that dinner is complimentary this evening. No charge." "Dad," Michael said with the patient tone he used when he thought I was being confused or difficult, "this isn't our restaurant. You can't just decide the meal is free." "Actually," I said, "I can." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the keys Romano had given me 20 minutes earlier. Simple brass keys on a ring with a small plastic tag that read Romano's owner. I set them on the table next to the untouched wine I had brought. "As of about an hour ago," I said, "I own this restaurant." The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had ever experienced. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a family enjoying each other's company, or the awkward pause that comes when someone says something inappropriate. This was the stunned, disbelieving silence that follows a revelation so unexpected that it takes several seconds for the brain to process what it has heard. Michael stared at the keys. Sarah looked from them to my face and back again. David put his phone down completely for the first time all evening. Linda's mouth was slightly open, as if she had been about to say something when my words rendered her speechless. "You bought Romano's?" Sarah said finally. "I did. Tonight?" "About an hour ago, yes." "While we were having dinner?" "While you were having dessert, actually." Michael picked up the keys, examined them as if they might be fake, some kind of elaborate joke or prop I had acquired to make a point. "Dad," he said, "this is crazy. You can't just buy a restaurant on impulse. You don't know anything about running a restaurant." "I know about running a business," I said. "I know about managing people and solving problems, and making decisions under pressure. I've been doing those things for 40 years. "But this is different," Sarah protested. "This is food service. This is completely outside your area of expertise. So was raising children, I said. But I figured that out as I went along. The comparison hit them exactly as I had intended it to. A reminder that I had successfully managed complex, high-stakes responsibilities Buffett, or that I wasn't the incompetent old man they apparently saw when they looked at me. How did you even afford this? David asked, practical considerations overriding his shock. This must have cost. It cost what it cost, I said. I had the resources to make it happen. Your retirement money? Michael's voice was rising slightly, the way it used to when he was a teenager and thought I was making a decision that would affect his life. Dad, you can't spend your retirement savings on something like this. I can spend my money on whatever I choose, I said calmly, just like you can spend your time with whoever you choose. The reference to our earlier conversation was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah caught it immediately, her face flushing slightly as she realized the connection between their dismissal of me and my decision to buy the restaurant where they had delivered that dismissal. This is about what we said earlier, she said, about the holidays, about finding other social connections. This is about me taking control of my own life, I said, about me deciding how I want to spend my time and energy and resources, about me choosing not to sit at home waiting for phone calls that come less and less frequently. Dad, Michael said, his voice taking on the careful tone people use when they think they're dealing with someone who might be having a mental health crisis. Buying a restaurant isn't going to solve your loneliness. It's not going to replace having a family. You're right, I said, but running a restaurant will give me something to do besides wonder when my family decided I was too much trouble to include in their lives. The words hung in the air like an accusation, which I suppose they were. Not a cruel or angry accusation, but a simple statement of fact that they couldn't deny or rationalize away. They had told me to find new social connections. They had suggested I seek out people my own age who could better understand my situation. They had recommended that I build a life that didn't depend on them for fulfillment or purpose. So I had, in the most dramatic and unexpected way possible. Romano appeared at our table, still wearing his apron, but with a smile that suggested he was enjoying this moment almost as much as I was. "Everything okay here?" he asked, though his eyes were twinkling with barely suppressed amusement. "Romano," I said, "I'd like you to meet my family, my children Michael, Sarah, and David and their spouses. They've been coming here for over 30 years. "Ah, yes," Romano said, nodding recognition. "I remember when they were small, always asking for extra breadsticks, always making noise but good noise, family noise. It's beautiful to see them grown up with families of their own." "Romano?" Sarah said weakly. "Is it true? Did our father really buy your restaurant tonight?" Romano's smile widened. "He did indeed. Your father, he is now my business partner, and very soon will be the owner of Romano's. It's very exciting, very good thing. He will take good care of this place, I think." The reality was sinking in now. I could see it in their faces. This wasn't a joke or a misunderstanding or some kind of emotional breakdown that could be managed and contained. This was a real business transaction that had real consequences, a decision their father had made without consulting them, without needing their permission, without caring whether they approved or understood. For the first time in 2 years, I had done something that surprised them. For the first time since Margaret died, I had acted with the kind of authority and independence they seemed to think I no longer possessed. And judging by the expressions around the table, they were beginning to realize that the father they had just dismissed as lonely and irrelevant might be more capable of changing his life than they had imagined. The phone calls started 3 days later. Michael was first, of course. He called Tuesday morning at exactly 8:30, early enough to catch me before I might leave the house, but late enough to show he had given careful thought to what he was going to say. "Dad, we need to talk about this restaurant situation." Restaurant situation. As if my purchase of Romano's was some kind of problem that required their intervention, rather than a business decision made by a competent adult. "What about it?" I asked, settling into my kitchen chair with my morning coffee. The same chair, the same coffee, but everything else about my life was different now. I had keys to a restaurant in my pocket, and meetings scheduled with suppliers and staff. I had something to do, something that belonged to me, something that mattered. "You can't seriously be planning to run a restaurant," Michael said. "You're 68 years old. You've never worked in food service. You have no idea what you're getting into." "I have exactly as much experience running a restaurant as you had experience being a father when your first child was born," I said, Somehow you figured that out. That's not the same thing, and you know it. Isn't it? Both involve taking responsibility for something important without being completely sure you know what you're doing. Both require learning as you go and making mistakes and adapting to challenges you didn't anticipate. He was quiet for a moment, probably realizing that arguing about my competence wasn't the approach most likely to change my mind. Look, Dad, if this is about money, if you need something to occupy your time, there are better ways to handle this. You could volunteer more hours at the library. You could take up golf. You could travel. Travel, by myself, to places where I would know no one and have nothing meaningful to do and no one waiting for me, and I returned. Michael, I said, do you remember what you told me at dinner on Christmas Eve? We told you we were concerned about your social isolation. You told me to find activities at the senior center. You told me to meet people my own age who could relate to my situation. You told me to build a life that didn't depend on you for fulfillment. Yes, but so I did. I found an activity that will occupy me 7 days a week. I'll be meeting lots of people, customers, suppliers, staff. I'll be building a life that is completely independent of whether my children want to include me in theirs. Another pause. He hadn't expected me to throw their own words back at them, hadn't considered that I might take their advice in ways they hadn't intended. This isn't what we meant, and you know it. Then maybe you should have been more specific about what you did mean. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Michael alternating between concern about my practical capabilities and frustration that I had made such a major decision without consulting them, as if I needed their permission to spend my own money and change my own life. Sarah showed up at the restaurant Thursday afternoon, unannounced, finding me in the office going over inventory reports with Romano. She knocked on the doorframe and entered without waiting for an invitation, the way she used to enter my study when she was a child, and had something urgent to discuss. Dad, we need to talk. Romano looked from her to me, reading the family tension with the skill of someone who had observed thousands of family dynamics play out in his dining room. I go check on the kitchen, he said diplomatically, leaving us alone. Sarah closed the door and sat across from me at the small desk, her expression a mixture of concern and exasperation that I remembered from her teenage years when she thought I was making decisions that would embarrass the entire family. Dad, what are you doing? I'm learning how to run a restaurant. Today Romano is teaching me about inventory management and supplier relationships. Yesterday we covered staff scheduling and payroll procedures. That's not what I mean, and you know it. This whole thing, buying Romanos, becoming a restaurateur at your age, what are you really trying to prove? Prove, as if my decision to take control of my own life was some kind of gesture designed to get their attention rather than a genuine attempt to build something meaningful. I'm not trying to prove anything, I said. I'm trying to create a life that has purpose and meaning and doesn't require anyone else's permission or approval. By buying the restaurant where we told you we needed some space from family gatherings, you don't see how that looks like revenge? Revenge. The word hung between us like an accusation. Maybe there was some truth to it. Maybe part of me had been motivated by the desire to show them that they couldn't dismiss me without consequences, that I wasn't the helpless old man they apparently thought I was. But if it was revenge, it wasn't the bitter, destructive kind. It was the kind of revenge that involved succeeding despite their expectations, proving my worth through action rather than argument, building something they couldn't ignore or dismiss. Sarah, I said, if you had told me you needed space from my presence at family gatherings, but you wanted to maintain our relationship in other ways, I might have handled this differently. But what you actually told me was that I was too dependent on you for social connection, that I needed to find fulfillment elsewhere, that I was making your children uncomfortable with my attention. Her face flushed slightly. She remembered exactly what had been said, exactly how it had felt to deliver that message to her father. So I found fulfillment elsewhere. I found a way to be socially connected that doesn't depend on you or your brothers at all. I found something that will make me too busy to worry about whether my grandchildren find my attention overwhelming. Dad, you're taking this too far. We never said we didn't want a relationship with you. You said you didn't want the relationship we had. You said you wanted something different, something more distant, something that required less of your time and emotional energy. This gives you exactly what you asked for. She was quiet for a moment, probably realizing that I was right, that they had indeed asked for distance, and I was simply providing it in a way they hadn't anticipated. What about holidays? She asked finally. What about Christmas and Thanksgiving? What about them? Are we still invited? Can we still have family dinners here? The question revealed everything about how their minds worked. They wanted the comfort and tradition of family gatherings, but they wanted them on their terms, with their father participating in ways that didn't inconvenience them or require too much of their attention. "You're welcome here any time," I said. "As customers, I'll make sure you get good service and excellent food." "As customers? You're the ones who established that we need new boundaries, new rules for how our family operates. These are the new rules. You're welcome in my restaurant the same way any other customers are welcome." "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. You wanted distance, you have it. You wanted me to stop depending on you for social connection. I've stopped. You wanted me to find activities that don't involve you. I found one." David's response came via text message on Friday afternoon. "Dad, heard about the restaurant. Does this mean you'll give me money for my business idea now that you're an entrepreneur?" Of all their reactions, David's was the most honest. He didn't pretend to be concerned about my well-being or confused about my motivations. He simply saw an opportunity to benefit from my new financial situation. I texted back, "Employment applications available at the restaurant. Starting position is dishwasher." Within an hour, he showed up in person, probably expecting me to be joking about the dishwasher position. I wasn't. "David," I said when he appeared in my office, "if you want to learn about business, if you want to understand what it takes to build something from the ground up, you're welcome to work here. But you'll start at the bottom like everyone else. Learn the business from the foundation up. Prove yourself worthy of more responsibility." "I don't want to wash dishes, Dad. I was thinking more like management level, maybe handling the business side of things." "The business side of things requires understanding every aspect of the operation. That includes washing dishes, serving customers, cleaning tables, and everything else that keeps a restaurant running." "That's not really my skill set." "Then develop new skills, or find employment somewhere else that better matches your current capabilities." He left without filling out an application, but he came back the next week with a different attitude and a willingness to start wherever I was willing to place him. Maybe he realized that this job opportunity was the closest thing to paternal support he was going to get from me going forward. Romano stayed through the 6-month transition period he had promised, teaching me everything he knew about the restaurant business and helping me understand the rhythm and demands of food service. But more than that, he became my closest confidant during those first difficult months, the one person who understood both the practical challenges I was facing and the emotional significance of what I was trying to accomplish. "Your children," he said one evening after we had closed for the night, "they are struggling to understand what you are doing." "They're struggling to understand that I don't need their permission to live my own life," I corrected. "Perhaps," he said with the wisdom that comes from decades of observing human behavior, "they are struggling to understand that their father is not the man they thought he was." He was right, of course. My children had seen me as someone whose best years were behind him, whose most important role in life was to be grateful for whatever attention they chose to give me. They had seen me as a problem to be managed rather than a person capable of surprising them. Buying Romano's had forced them to reconsider their assumptions about who their father was and what he was capable of accomplishing. It had shifted the power dynamic between us in ways they were still trying to process. They now called regularly, visited frequently, and showed an interest in my daily activities that felt both gratifying and hollow. I knew their renewed attention was partly motivated by curiosity about the restaurant's success and concerns about their inheritance, but I also sensed genuine regret in their voices, a recognition that they had misjudged me and the consequences of that misjudgment. The restaurant was thriving under my ownership. Romano's recipes and reputation, combined with my business management skills and genuine enthusiasm for the work, had created something better than either of us had accomplished alone. We were busier than ever, with reservations booked weeks in advance and a waiting list for weekend dinners. My days were filled with meaningful activity, managing staff, meeting with suppliers, greeting customers, solving the 1,000 small problems that arise in any business. I was working harder than I had in years, but it was work that mattered, work that produced something valuable, work that people appreciated and respected. And my children, who had worried that I was too dependent on them for social connection, now found that their father was often too busy to take their phone calls or accommodate their schedules. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. 6 months after that Christmas Eve dinner that changed everything, Michael brought his teenagers to the restaurant on a Saturday night. Not for a special occasion, not because they needed a convenient place to eat, but because he wanted his children to meet their grandfather in his new role as a successful business owner. Grandpa Frank runs this whole place, he told them as I showed them to their table, his voice carrying a pride I hadn't heard in years. He bought it and learned the entire restaurant business from scratch. 16-year-old Emma looked around the bustling dining room with genuine amazement. You really own all of this? I do, I said, helping her into her chair. Every table, every menu item, every headache that comes with keeping customers happy. That's so cool, 14-year-old Jake said to you. Do you get to eat here for free whenever you want? One of the benefits of ownership, I confirmed, though I've learned that restaurant owners actually eat restaurant food less than you'd think. When you see how it's made all day long, you sometimes just want a sandwich at home. They peppered me with questions throughout dinner, about how restaurants work, about managing employees, about dealing with difficult customers, questions that showed genuine curiosity about my life and work, the kind of interest my children used to show but had stopped expressing years ago. Michael watched these interactions with something that looked like wonder, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years, as if he was finally understanding that his father was still capable of learning new things, building new relationships, creating something valuable that had nothing to do with his former role as their parent. Dad, he said as they were finishing dessert, I owe you an apology. For what? For underestimating you. For thinking you couldn't handle something like this. For assuming you needed us to manage your social life because you weren't capable of managing it yourself. The apology felt genuine, though I suspected it was motivated as much by respect for my success as by regret for his previous dismissiveness. Success has a way of changing how people view your capabilities and judgment. You don't owe me an apology for being concerned about my well-being, I said. You owe me an apology for trying to solve my problems by removing me from your lives instead of helping me find better solutions. He nodded, understanding the distinction. They had wanted to help me, but they had wanted to help me in ways that required nothing from them, that solved my problems without creating any inconvenience for their lives. Sarah's reconciliation came in the form of social media posts that made me uncomfortable but seemed important to her. Photos of us together at the restaurant, captions about her inspiring father who had reinvented himself after her mother's death, hashtags about family pride and entrepreneurial spirit. She was rewriting the narrative of our relationship, transforming me from a lonely old man who had needed their intervention into a dynamic businessman who deserved their admiration. The truth was more complicated than either version, but I understood that she needed to present our family story in ways that reflected well on all of us. I'm proud of you, Dad, she said during one of her visits, her phone out and ready to document our conversation for her followers. You've really shown all of us what it means to take control of your life. The pride felt real, even if it was mixed with the kind of performative family devotion that social media encouraged. She genuinely admired what I had accomplished, even if that admiration came partly from relief that I was no longer her problem to solve. David's transformation was the most dramatic and the most meaningful. He showed up for his dishwashing shift every Tuesday and Thursday evening, working quietly and efficiently, learning the restaurant business from the ground up exactly as I had required. But more than that, he was learning discipline, responsibility, and the satisfaction that comes from work that contributes to something larger than himself. The structure and purpose of regular employment seemed to agree with him in ways his previous freelance ventures never had. This is harder than I expected, he said after his third week of washing dishes and cleaning tables. But it's also more satisfying. I can see the results of what I'm doing. I can see how my work affects the restaurant's success. That's the difference between having a job and having a role in something that matters, I told him. Every position here, from dishwasher to owner, contributes to whether our customers have a good experience. He nodded with the understanding that comes from hands-on experience rather than theoretical knowledge. For the first time in his adult life, he was learning what it felt like to be essential rather than peripheral, valued rather than tolerated, part of something successful rather than struggling to find his place. By his 6th month at Romano's, I promoted him to assistant manager, a decision that surprised both of us but felt right based on his work ethic and growing understanding of the business. He had earned the position through competence rather than family connection, and we both knew the difference. The restaurant business had taught me things out myself that I hadn't known at 68. I learned that I enjoyed solving operational problems, that I had a talent for managing people, that I could adapt to new challenges more easily than anyone, including myself, had expected. But more importantly, it had taught me that I didn't need my children's approval or inclusion to have a meaningful life. I had spent 2 years after Margaret's death waiting for them to invite me into their lives, hoping they would recognize my value and need my presence. Instead, I had created something valuable on my own, something that made me too busy and engaged to worry about whether they called often enough, or included me in their plans often enough, or appreciated me sufficiently. The power dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted. Where they had once seen me as a responsibility they needed to manage, they now saw me as someone whose success and independence commanded respect. Where I had once hoped for their attention and approval, I now had the confidence that comes from building something meaningful without their help. Our relationships were better now, but they were different. They called more often, but the calls felt less obligatory and more genuine. They visited the restaurant regularly, but they came as customers who were proud to know the owner, rather than as children dutifully checking on an aging parent. We had family dinners again, but they happened on my terms, in my restaurant when my schedule permitted. I was no longer grateful for whatever time they could spare me. They were grateful for the time I could spare them. The change wasn't entirely comfortable for any of us. They had to adjust to having a father who didn't need their emotional support or practical assistance, who had his own social connections and professional obligations and daily concerns that didn't involve them. I had to adjust to relationship, as with my children, that were based on mutual respect rather than their sense of obligation to include me in their lives. But it was healthier. It was more honest. It was based on what we could offer each other rather than what we thought we owed each other. Romano had been right when he told me that sometimes we need to surprise even ourselves. I had surprised myself by succeeding in a business I knew nothing about, by adapting to challenges I hadn't anticipated, by building a new life that was more fulfilling than anything I had imagined possible at 68. But the biggest surprise was discovering that the best revenge against being dismissed by your family isn't anger or resentment or cutting them out of your life in return. The best revenge is living so well, so successfully, so independently that they remember why they needed you in the first place, and why you no longer need them to validate your worth. My children had wanted me to find new friends, new activities, new sources of fulfillment that didn't depend on them. They had wanted me to become someone who didn't require their time and attention to be happy. They got exactly what they asked for. And now they were discovering that having a father who doesn't need you is more complicated than having a father who needs you too much. Now they were learning that respect has to be earned rather than assumed, that relationships require mutual value rather than one-sided obligation. Every time they walked into Romano's and saw the restaurant bustling with satisfied customers, every time they watched me manage staff and solve problems and make decisions with confidence and competence, they were reminded that they had underestimated the man who raised them. They were reminded that love without respect is just pity, that family relationships work best when they're chosen rather than assumed, that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you care about is force them to prove they don't need you. I had spent 2 years after Margaret. Its death trying to remain relevant in my children's lives. Now I had become relevant in my own life, and they were the ones trying to remain part of mine. It was a better arrangement for everyone involved, built on a foundation of mutual appreciation rather than one-sided dependence. And every night, as I locked up Romano's and headed home to the house I no longer shared with anyone, I felt something I hadn't felt since Margaret died. The satisfaction that comes from a day well spent, work well done, a life well lived, regardless of who else chooses to be part of it. That, I had learned, is the secret to surviving any loss, any betrayal, any attempt by others to determine your worth. You don't wait for someone else to give your life meaning, you create it yourself.